think this wins the award for the most unhinged lighting that I have ever filmed in. I look like I'm on 12 different drugs right now, and I haven't slept in 3 days. And like I've just witnessed my carefully built empire collapse before my very eyes. In short, I look like I'm about to say something controversial on the internet. Hello and welcome to a new series on this channel, which I am calling Actually, It's Good. A series in which I read books that have a 3.47 star or lower on Goodreads and evaluate whether they're good. Why 3.47 stars, you ask? Because the queen of literature, Donna Tartt's lowest rated book on Goodreads as of filming this video in January 2023 is The Little Friend, and that has a 3.47 on Goodreads. So that is the metric by which we will measure whether Goodreads likes or dislikes something. Today I'm going to be talking about Love in the Time of Contagion, a Diagnosis by Laura Kipnis. Right now, this book sits at a 2.95 out of 5 stars on Goodreads, which is pretty dismal. I read this in spite of the rating last year. Shockingly, Goodreads has no taste. This book is actually really good, and I am going to talk a little bit about what makes it good. COVID books, which is what this one is, tend to get more heavily scrutinized than other books. And I feel like COVID is becoming one of those topics where it's like, no matter what you say about it, you're kind of incorrect. I think that this book kind of had the odds stacked against it in that way. I mean, so this was published in 2022. And I think that while during COVID, there was a brief period of time where people were kind of reading pandemic books and like using books about COVID to help them through the COVID pandemic. I feel like in 2022, the tide has sort of shifted a little bit, and now people just like really don't want to like hear or think about COVID. And now I feel like I'm like the sole person who is still like interested in figuring out what the hell happened and what it all meant. And so that was a part of why I liked this book. Laura Kipnis is a cultural critic and a former video artist, and she's quite well published, and currently she's a professor at Northwestern University, and she teaches filmmaking. So she's not like a storyteller by trade, she is much more of like analyst and a critic. And that really comes through in her voice. And personally, I think Goodreads kind of can't handle edgy women writers. I feel like Otessa Moshfegh is accepted because she is still kind of leaning into that like androgynous, like weird girl thing. But like Laura Kipnis is like very biting and unapologetic. She's not like nice. Like she doesn't sugarcoat the things that she says about COVID and the ways that it affected the ways that we love each other and relationships. Like for example, one of the things that she talks about in this is the whole phenomenon that has kind of arisen, more and more people living alone and not wanting to live with other people. And a lot of times people kind of frame the phenomenon of more and more people living alone as this kind of like tragic thing, and you know, the complete destruction of like family structures and community and blah blah. And Kipnis is like, well, that's all well and good, but are we not going to talk about the fact that everybody's a narcissist now and is like impossible to live with? And like a third of people are like these super just psychotic, like politically radicalized, like people for whom like bullying is seen as like a moral good. and the other third are just these whining perma victims who are incapable of taking responsibility for anything themselves. And then you've got maybe like a third of people who are normal. So she kind of makes the argument that like people getting more and more politically radicalized and more just kind of like isolated in themselves during COVID has really worsened what she calls the narcissism epidemic. And like that, she says, contributes to the fact that nobody wants to hang out or live with each other anymore. This book is just like full of observations like that. She talks a lot about, kind of negatively, about monogamy, which I disagreed with, but I found interesting nonetheless to read about. And she just talks about the strain that COVID put on relationships. It forced her to realize the kind of harsh truth that way fewer relationships are sound, and how a lot of people really don't know how to connect with each other or do the work of connecting in close quarters like they used to, at least. Her observations about like relationships and like the very specific ways that she has seen like relationships in her life or in other people's lives go awry, I thought it was really interesting. It's much more an ideas book than like a well-funded, well-documented quantitative research book on COVID and relationships. And a lot of it is kind of more abstractly connected to COVID, so I could see how that could be a problem for people. But I felt that that was kind of in line with the way that I currently feel about COVID, just because I do find it hard to tell which things are like actually a result of COVID in itself. And I guess that's all in the title, right? It's about love in the time of Contagion, not here's how love was only in a vacuum impacted by COVID, right? Because I think there are so many other things like just late stage capitalism and like Trump and the internet and social media that also contributed to it. It's more of a map of the intersection of all of those things and how they impact the way that people love each other than it is like a direct like cause and effect diagram, if that makes sense. Yeah, I don't know. I found this really harsh and really interesting, and actually I loved the writer's voice. Goodreads is kind of like shitting themselves over her being just too harsh. Like she's too mean, people say. She's too mean, like she takes herself too seriously, she's too brash, and actually I found that super refreshing in a day and age where everything has to be preceded by a 10-mile long disclaimer. I kind of really appreciated like reading a woman who just kind of like says it, you know? Even if I found some of her thoughts to be disagreeable or absurd or whatever, it overall, like, honestly, it's just like a really nice piece. Here's a couple of like statements that she makes. Isn't coupledom always a form of double entry bookkeeping, a ledger of debits and credits? Which we know because so many couples dissolve for precisely these reasons. It's not worth it, I'm giving more than I'm getting, as opposed to happy couples who, by definition, accrue compound interest, banking their love in a joint account, knowing they're richer together than apart. As debates rage about what to call it and who's responsible for it, sex itself appears to be getting infinitely more miserable. She talks a little bit about choking during sex and how that's been getting more popular. 40%, she says, of the under 30 cohort say they've choked someone or been choked, not always consensually. If it were possible to turn sex into something very unpleasant, it appears that's the plan. Hearing that college students are having infrequent sex and fleeing the gender binary, it's not hard to understand why. I can imagine that that comment probably upset a lot of people. But, I mean, the fact of the matter is, when you make something more complicated, instead of having, like, clear defined set roles within relationships, people fleeing the gender binary does, like, complicate that, and that is, like, hard for a lot of people. Any social change, especially in that kind of intimate realm, like I would imagine would be hard. You fall into these stupid roles. You're the enforcer, you're the surveillance state, you're the pill counter, you're measuring the level on the bourbon. The little warden jailbird roleplay games couples get up to. You're vested with the power to forgive or rebuke each binge or relapse, which binds you more closely while also making you a parental figure, not always so great in the bedroom department. Yeah, I just found myself really underlining a lot in this, actually. I have a ton of text marking in this. Blah, blah, blah. She talks about digital capitalism, oversharing, just the disaster that is like Gen Z relationships. And then she has a really interesting bit at the end here where she got a bunch of things overheard on the internet mid-lockdown. So these are like little statements that she has found on the internet about just the state of relationships during COVID. My partner doesn't like the way the house is at the moment. I didn't like her commenting on it. He hates me when I bring up the fact that women leaders are doing a better job navigating COVID and understanding the dangers. My spouse is upset that I washed my hands at the kitchen sink after coming from outside. I tried to remember, but usually forgot. Sorry, not sorry. We've seen some shit during our time together, so we've had practice at gently coaxing one another off the ledge. More irritation, but also more partnership. We became too familiar with each other. Nobody could escape to school or an office. Eating and cooking every meal together became tiresome. More watching of TV together and talking about it afterward. Slightly more sex. He counts how many berries he eats for breakfast, and before you ask, 12 blackberries or 18 blueberries. We're drinking a lot more wine than before. It's all just like really interesting little anecdotes like that I thought was like a really interesting survey of how people handled COVID and how it affected their relationships. So honestly, I recommend. I can't remember if I gave this 4 or 5 stars, but I found this was like a really clarifying piece, and I actually really, really enjoyed it. It doesn't deserve the rating that it currently has on Goodreads, so I would highly, highly recommend you check this out if you're into COVID books, books about love and romance. If you were into my All About Love by Bell Hooks video, and you want kind of like a contemporary, much more cynical kind of companion to All About Love, this is it. And yeah, it's got a really cute, ugly, cute little cover. Let me know in the comments if you have read this or if you're thinking about reading it now that you've seen this video. Miss Kipnis does not deserve the hate that she got on this one. Yeah, that's it. Bye.